All right, so I reached out for some help on this. Actually, I saw the title of this book, Rediscovering the American Covenant, Roadmap to Restoring America. And I thought, this is going to be interesting. Author Mark Burrell joins me right now. Hey, Mark.
Scott, thanks for having me. And you did a brilliant job with your lead-in on the impact of the Declaration.
You know, I read it the last half hour right before you joined us. I read it on air. And every time I read it, I'm thinking, do people really understand what's going on here? This is the place where we find out why government exists. It's to protect the rights the Creator gave us. We also learn that rights can come from a Creator. That's pretty important stuff, Mark.
Yeah, it's the basis of our founding principles and our American identity. And so it's important, there's so much here, but it's important to recognize the difference between our founding principles, which are in the first two paragraphs of the Declaration, and our operating principles, which are found in the Constitution. Constitution's important, Scott, but the case that I make in my book, Rediscovering the American Covenant, is that we have a significant portion of our fellow citizens who either don't know or have fundamentally rejected our national founding covenant, which is the Declaration of Independence. That's what it is. It's a covenant between the founders who signed it and God, and they followed the biblical template for how to start a nation God's way. And that's why God blessed their efforts.
So this word covenant jumped out at me too, because I'm kind of the church I go to, we talk about covenant theology, and we definitely understand God's covenant made with his people. You used that word on purpose in this title, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. It's meant to be provocative. It's, of course, a biblical word. And another word for folks who may not be as familiar with it is it's simply a contract. That's what it is. It's a contract that those signers made representing the colonies that they represented when they were sent to Philadelphia in 1776. And what they were doing is acknowledging God in the first two paragraphs. And first off, the law of nature is God, which is a direct reference to the moral law. And then the rights that are inalienable that you mentioned. And then they make an appeal to God. That last paragraph, and I'm so glad you read it. I wish I'd have known. I'd have tuned in. Because the last paragraph, appealing to the supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, the truthfulness of what they were trying to do, and then committing their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. And then they declared it. I mean, these folks did the exact biblical thing for how you start a nation. And by the way, it's the same process for starting a marriage. The principles are identical, which they should be, because communities are made up of families, and so it scales up.
So I must admit that as much as I'm involved in this and studied the Declaration and looked at it and been doing radio for 20 years, and it was actually, the Lee brothers were founded kind of on this patriot position of the greatness of the country, and I never thought of the Declaration of Independence as a covenant. I didn't think of it that way. It's really interesting to have that point of view on it and see how it all came together. Now, these 56 men that signed this, I guess that they weren't all Christians, but they all had this principle, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's important, a couple of things, and I cover all this in the book, by the way, talking about the lead up to the founding. What happened about 30 or 40 years before the founding was the first Great Awakening. This, of course, was a period of revival throughout the colonies. And part of that revival was getting really clear on the theology of how to govern. And this wasn't by accident, Scott. This was because these folks were living on the edge of the known world. And when they showed up, especially the Pilgrims, they were expecting to join the Jamestown colony. And when they realized they couldn't, they did what they had been taught to do, which is to establish a covenant and to sign it before they got off the Mayflower. And of course, that's known as the Mayflower Compact, right. Which, by the way, they followed the same pattern: acknowledge, appeal, commit, declare. Those 4 words, write them down. That is the template.
Well, you said them pretty quick. Do you mind saying them again?
Yeah, sure. Well, it's funny. I talked to my wife. It's AACD. So acknowledge, appeal, commit, and declare. And of course, you do that when you get married too. You follow the same path. And if you put those 4 words and then read the Declaration again, and you'll see that that's exactly what they were doing.
Very interesting. Yeah, would this make See, as we look at our culture today and the political anger between the two parties, by the way, I don't think it's much different than it has been almost our entire history in our country. I think it's more pronounced now because we have social media and 24/7 time. I really do. I mean, Jefferson wanted to kill, or Adams wanted to kill Jefferson, put him in jail, I think is what. I think Adams, was it one or the other? Adams wanted to put Jefferson in jail, or Jefferson wanted to put Adams, one of the two. So this not much different. It's just more hyped because of that. Don't you think that on the 4th of July week, as we come together, we could at least find common principles to rally around through the Declaration? Wouldn't this be like one of those pieces where what Biden stood up and said, look, I want everyone to get Mark Burrell's book, and I want the entire country to read it this week, and then at the end of the week, we're going to have a little test and see how wouldn't that make a difference?
I believe it would, and that is my purpose in writing the book. I wrote it because I want to start a national conversation about who we are as Americans, not debating about the Constitution. We just had a bunch of rulings come out of the Supreme Court, and that's all well and good. But there's still, how do we get around it? How do we do this? How do we do that? And it's like, why? What don't you understand about the law of nature and of nature's God? The moral law. Our entire nation was founded on the principle that if a civil leader is governing immorally over a long period of time with no intent to change, that leader becomes ineligible. They forfeit their God-given responsibility to lead. That's the operative principle behind the American founding. And these folks, they do it with reckless abandon. They don't hesitate at all to show that they fundamentally reject our founding covenant. And so, Scott, it's like we're in a bad marriage. I mean, could you imagine if you said to your wife, "Hey, I've got a girlfriend in the other county, and I'd sort of like to spend half my life with her, and I'll still love you, but I'm going to have an open marriage and blah blah blah." I mean, that is sort of what's going on here at a national level. They have rejected the covenant that our founders made and that we inherited, and that, by the way, Scott, it's still in effect. That declaration is still in effect. There's been no legal, activity that would nullify it. Just because a couple of Supreme Court cases, declared this or that unconstitutional, that does not nullify our founding agreement. And so this is the conversation we need to have.
Yeah, no doubt.
And what better time to have it than July 4th?
And I couldn't agree more. That's why I thought it'd be great to have you on. Are the churches of America failing us?
They are absolutely failing us. I have a whole chapter on that. And the problem is they don't understand the theology behind civil government. And so their approach is submit and pray, come what may. I mean, that's pretty much it.
Yeah. No
and I make the case that, there's 5 questions you need to ask. First off, what does God expect from the nations? Second question, who does he expect to govern and lead? Third question, what's the right response when a nation's civil leaders are governing justly? That's when Romans 13 and 1 Timothy 2 apply. The fourth question is, what's the proper response when civil leaders are governing immorally? And the answer there is to resist and restore, through whatever means that seem prudent. And then the last question, and this is the important one, Scott, how do you restore a wayward nation? And to answer all these questions, you look to the nation of Israel to see how God dealt with them. Mm-hmm. And on the last question, we see through a few kings, like most of Israel's kings were bad, right?
Yep.
But they had a couple good ones, Josiah and Nehemiah. What did they do? They both, when they realized that they were not keeping the covenant or that they were reforming a community, as Nehemiah was, they got everyone together, they read the covenant aloud, and they all recommitted. And God blessed their reign for a season, because you have to keep recommitting.
Sure.
That's the point. And that was the point of July 4th. We're supposed to be recommitting. The whole nation should tune in and have the Declaration read in the Congress, not the President. The President is not sovereign, right? Who's sovereign in America? The people are. So the House ought to be reading the Declaration, and we all ought to be listening, and we all ought to, ideally, recommit.
That's a great point. The churches don't want, it's my experience, the church wants to avoid politics.
They do.
And it's, I don't know how they do it, but they do. And they want to just avoid it and talk about, and I think a lot of it is legitimately kind of a position where they they think, hey, if we can just avoid it and talk about, different things. But when every once in a while, when you run across a church that's involved, it's powerful. I mean, it's good and it's right. And I said something about the pulpits ablaze with righteousness when Alex de Tocqueville came here looking for the greatness of America and looked from across our fruited plains. He simply said the reason America is great is because America is good. And if America ever ceases to be good, it will cease to be great. And the reason it was good is because their pulpits were ablaze with righteousness. And that's what we need now.
Yeah. In fact, I have a whole chapter on that. Chapter 4 is about evangelism. And I basically refute this notion that politics is contrary or, conflicts with evangelism. And I point first to Deuteronomy 4, where Moses tells the children of Israel that the reason you're to govern justly is because the nations of the world will see you, and they will come and check you out. And in doing so, they will learn about the God of Israel. And this is exactly what happened, for instance, through the visit of the Queen of Sheba. And I talk about that in the book. And so God's evangelistic strategy in the Old Testament, Scott, was to govern justly. And so the whole reason Jesus said in Matthew 28, the Great Commission, he said, go out into the world, and share the gospel, making disciples of all nations. The whole reason he did that, Scott, was because it was a change in strategy. And by the way, it was a new covenant instead of an Israel-based covenant. It included everyone through the shed blood of Christ.
Spectacular.
And so he had to make a point out of telling them, okay, folks, new plan.
Right.
We're not going to stay in Israel anymore. I want you to go. So it changes from a stay strategy to a go strategy. But notice the goal, making disciples of all nations. That means all nations governing in a way that honor God.
Mark, how can people find out more about you and your book?
So I have a website, defendamericanliberty.com, hopefully memorable, defendamericanliberty.com. And you can get the book there. It's also wherever books are sold. And you can reach out to me. I'm now in the process of, I want to work with churches. To your point, Scott, a lot of pastors, they just don't know. And so I wrote the book to really be a handbook for pastors and church leaders to be able to understand the theology behind civil government and how it laid the groundwork for America, and to address all the typical questions like slavery, the three-fifths clause, all that stuff. I address all that in the book.
Very good. Well, I can't wait to dive in it even further, and I appreciate your passion for this and joining me to discuss it. And I wish you the best of July 4th holidays.
Yeah, sounds good. You as well. Thank you for reading the document. I think that's so important. And love to join you again after you get a chance to read the book.
Oh, absolutely. I'd love to. In fact, you're welcome here anytime. I mean, I think we're like-minded enough, and it'd be great to have you. So I appreciate you very much. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's Mark Burrell, the author of Rediscovering the American Covenant, Roadmap to Restore America. You should check it out. DefendAmericanLiberty.com.